We were promised a better world. That was a lie. Two superpowers emerged from World War II, divided by opposing cultural and philosophical identities. America, the West, championed capitalism, positioning itself as a bastion of liberty and individual freedom. In the East, the Soviet Union promoted communism, aiming to create a stateless and classless society. Their wartime alliance gave way to decades of political tension and proxy wars that brought the world to the brink of total nuclear destruction. Hello and welcome to Animation Propaganda. In the last episode, we explored America's war on drugs and how cartoons were used to sway kids away from using them. This time, we'll look at the two dominant ideologies of the 20th century, capitalism and communism, and the ways they were promoted or condemned through animation. Yes, we are heading back to the politics and paranoia of the Cold War, but first, I'd like to take a quick trip through the early history of Soviet animation. We cover the birth of Russian animation in our Ladislav Starevich video, ending around the time he fled the country when the Bolsheviks seized power, in many ways taking the medium with them. The Bolsheviks had gained and maintained support through the use of agitprop, placing political messages in accessible media. Think of it as pop culture propaganda. This was an extremely effective method of spreading their message, as much of the population was illiterate, especially in more remote areas. To reach those outside of major cities, designated trains were used, dubbed agit-trains. These were brightly painted and covered in political slogans and imagery, eye-catching, I'm sure, on the backdrop of rural Russia. They not only carried orators, but also served as a mobile library and later movie theater. In episode 1, we saw how important film was to propaganda, but propaganda also played a pivotal role in the development of Soviet cinema. Obviously, there was the groundbreaking battleship Potemkin, but 3 years earlier, in 1922, a partnership between the Soviets and German communists led to a film studio for the worker. Murrow Film, named after the Russian acronym for the Workers' International Relief. This was an organization that provided aid to famine-stricken Germans living in Russia, would produce hundreds of films, many of which can be classified as propaganda. Murrow Film was also responsible for bringing animation back to Russia, again in the form of propaganda, with 1924's Interplanetary Revolution. With the subtitle, an event very likely to happen in 1929, this imagined Soviets chasing fascists and capitalists from this planet and pursuing them through space, spreading communism across the galaxy in the process. A parody of Yakov Betancenov's Leda, which was produced the same year by Murrow Film, it was animated using cutouts in a constructivist style by 3 artists, Nikolai Kodatev, Zenon Komisarenko, and Yuri Merkulov. They followed it up the next year with China in Flames. Funded by the government, China in Flames preached solidarity with the oppressed people of China, painting capitalists as imperialistic monsters. The film is notable for its runtime, making it one of the world's first feature-length animations, as well as being the first major work from Ivan Ivanov and the Bromberg sisters, Zenaida and Valentina. They worked as assistant artists on the film and would go on to define Russian animation in the years to come. Following the rise of the Nazis, Murrow Film was seen as a threat to both Soviet Russia and Germany. Ties were severed, and the studio folded in 1936. The rise of organized labor during the early 20th century led many to believe communism was gaining traction in America. The perceived connection of these movements to anarchism bred fears of Bolshevik-style revolution and what became known as the First Red Scare. These suspicions would be reignited following the Second World War. The Soviet Union had spread its influence across Asia and Eastern Europe. Fearing America was once again vulnerable, the US government set out on an aggressive anti-communist campaign. At the heart of their fears lied the atomic bomb. Its use and the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a contributing factor to the two nations falling out, as Joseph Stalin, who was not informed of America's intent to actually use the bomb, believed this destroyed the balance of power. He wasn't wrong, as the US had hoped to leverage their new weapon and force the Soviets' hand in international matters. To ensure America's secrets would be kept safe, President Truman introduced the Loyalty Order in 1947. This established the Federal Employees Loyalty Program, subjecting those in office to an examination that would determine how American they were in hopes of weeding out those with subversive or communist ties. These were carried out by the FBI and was designed by its director, J. Edgar Hoover. The Soviets' testing of a nuclear weapon in 1949 further fueled speculation that communist spies had infiltrated the US government. Paranoia ran wild, and it was not uncommon for unsubstantiated allegations to be made against prominent figures in the name of patriotism. This style of political attack has since become known as McCarthyism, after its latest proponent, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy made a career out of accusing those he deemed enemies with the aim of discrediting them. His claims were not limited to communism. He also frequently accused those he opposed or who opposed him as homosexuals. In 1953, McCarthy would oversee investigations into the United States Army. He was accused of using his influence to grant special privileges to Private David Shine, who had worked under McCarthy as a consultant prior to being drafted. Shine maintained a close relationship with McCarthy's chief counsel, Roy Cohn, who reportedly threatened to wreck the army if these privileges were not granted. On account of this, McCarthy and company soon found themselves the subject of an investigation. The hearings were broadcast live on the then new medium of television, showcasing McCarthy's usual temperament and shtick. This included insinuating his opposition's lawyer, Joseph Welch, was gay. Though he was eventually found not to have misused his authority, his public image was tarnished due to his behavior. His former allies began seeing him as a liability, and he was censured in 1954. McCarthy would fall into alcoholism and became addicted to morphine. Harry J. Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, learned of this addiction and encouraged him to quit. He refused. Despite, at one time, running an aggressive anti-drug campaign, Anslinger chose to supply McCarthy with morphine until his death in 1957. Running parallel to Truman and McCarthy's investigations was the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. In addition to investigating government agencies, HUAC targeted the entertainment world. The committee was under the belief that communism was rampant in Hollywood, and that members of the film industry were placing subtle political messages in their work. They would find powerful allies in Ronald Reagan, then president of the Screen Actors Guild, and Walt Disney. In 1937, the staff at Disney's rival studio, Fleischer, went on strike. Given the popularity of Popeye, production was sped up with no increase in wages. Their hours were long and the pay was low, but the tipping point came when in-betweener Dan Glass contracted tuberculosis and died, which many blamed on the studio's working conditions. Those who protested or hinted at unionizing were fired. At the time, the closest thing animators had to a union was the Commercial Artists and Designers Union, or CADU. The CADU attempted to bargain with studio head Max Fleischer, but he declined. The strike commenced on May 7th and would last just over 5 months before Paramount Pictures, who distributed Fleischer's films, stepped in. Conditions improved and those who had been fired were reinstated. The efforts of the Fleischer strike led to the creation of the Screen Cartoonists Guild, which, by 1941, had signed contracts with every major studio except one. Disney's industry dominance allowed him to pay his employees the highest wages, and the success of Snow White brought him a brand new studio, complete with a gym and other amenities for them to enjoy. But not every staff member could access these, and the disparity between highest earners and lowest was great. This, combined with a wave of recent firings, following the lackluster performance of Disney features, led to many of Disney's staff becoming disillusioned in their roles, among them Art Babbitt. Babbitt was one of Disney's best-paid animators. He is credited with developing Goofy, and was responsible for animating the Queen in Snow White and Geppetto in Pinocchio. Despite his comfortable position, Babbitt opposed Disney's enforced hierarchy. He joined the SCG and proposed Disney unionize his studio. Disney responded by telling his employees they should be thankful for what they have and try harder if they want more. This had the opposite effect Disney had hoped for and caused more of them to join the SCG. With pressure mounting, Disney fired Babbitt and 16 others, a decision that backfired when, on May 29, 1941, half of his staff went on strike. The strike dragged on for months, disrupting work on projects, most notably Dumbo. As a dig, Disney would lampoon the picketers in Dumbo, portraying them as clowns. It was only when pressured by the government that Disney caved and signed, though the strike would have a lasting emotional effect. He reportedly never recovered from the perceived betrayal. In 1947, when HUAC put Hollywood on trial, Disney would blame the strike on communist insurgents, with many artists he named being blacklisted from the industry. America's victory in World War II led to the largest economic expansion in human history. Their industrial sector had been mobilized during the war and was spared any loss or destruction. As such, the U.S. economy did not experience the same struggle recovering as most other nations did. This allowed its citizens a standard of life that would have been unimaginable to them during the pre-war depression. They could consume. The transition from war effort to the mass production of consumer goods led to an overabundance of stock. To move product, manufacturers relied heavily on advertising. Advertisers promoted the idea of the nuclear family, a mother, father, and children all living under one roof. With housing, both plentiful and affordable, they encouraged young families to fill their new homes with exciting modern inventions and appliances. Consumerism is intrinsically linked to capitalism, and many companies grew out of this period into multinational conglomerates, with people free to make as much money as they wanted. A most vocal proponent of capitalism, and probably many people's introduction to the concept, was animator and film producer John Sutherland. Sutherland began his career at Disney, working as an animator on 1931's The Beach Party. He also apparently voiced Bambi, despite someone else's name appearing in the credits. He would, however, marry the voice of Bambi's mother, Paula Winslow. The more you know. A firm believer in free enterprise, he was contracted by Harding University to produce a series of shorts celebrating American values and the virtues of capitalism. Among others, this resulted in Make Mine Freedom. The film finds four American archetypes: a politician, farmer, factory worker, and businessman, tempted to sign away their freedom by a salesman, promising a magic collectivist cure for their political divisions. All show interest, but are then swayed when a stranger shows them their future under communism. In the end, the four come together and chase the salesman away, praising the free market. Other clients of Sutherland include the American Petroleum Institute, who funded the pro-oil Destination Earth, the New York Stock Exchange, which gave us working dollars, and General Electric, who bankrolled what is perhaps his most lasting short, A is for Atom. A is for Atom outlines not only what an atom is, but how it can be harnessed for nuclear energy. It also explains how this can be used for power or for war, as well as for agricultural and medical purposes. Seems safe. Sutherland's cartoons obviously portray capitalism in a positive light, and would occasionally take shots at communism. Speaking of taking shots at communism, in 1945, George Orwell published Animal Farm. The book was a thinly veiled allegory for the Soviet uprising and Stalin's subsequent rule, as though those involved were barnyard animals. In 1954, the CIA financed an animated adaptation produced by British studio Halas and Batchelor, who had previously produced propaganda during the Second World War. While the book was critical of Stalin and the Soviet Union, the movie was altered to portray their situation much worse than it was under their former leader, a human. The most obvious change is the ending. Spoiler alert. In the book, the animals overtake their human overlords only to realize they become one and the same. The movie alters this to have the animals stage an uprising against their inferior new leader. The Soviet Union's victory was at the cost of some 18 million lives, 7 million of which were civilians. The war had destroyed 1,700 towns and over 70,000 villages, leaving 25 million homeless. Its financial costs? $192 billion. In short, the Soviets were devastated. This is perhaps why their propaganda was so optimistic. One of the major themes in Soviet propaganda was revolution, the idea of the new man, the new society, the feeling of always being on the cusp of some great new world. However, they portrayed capitalism in a much more negative light. One of the most iconic examples of anti-capitalist propaganda is Witold Borislavsky's The Millionaire. Produced in 1963, The Millionaire follows the corrupting of a bulldog who has left wealth by its owner. The dog uses its new money to live a lavish lifestyle and influence policy, becoming a member of Congress. The parties it attends are marked by excess and decadence, with the patrons transforming into monsters. Soviet propaganda would also target America's relationship with people of color. Mr. Twister, based on the poem of the same name, features a white, wealthy American who loves to travel the world. Landing in the USSR, he is shocked to learn the man in the hotel room next to him is black. He refuses to stay, but finding no other vacancies is forced to return, only to be placed in a room full of people of various ethnicities. The government's aim was to indoctrinate its citizens with the idea that American culture was inherently corrupt and evil. In my opinion, this is best expressed in Vladimir Terezov's Shooting Range from 1979. Shooting Range presents America as having abundant wealth, and yet the streets are full of people looking for work. A shady capitalist offers one of them a job in his shooting gallery, whose targets are symbols of American culture, including popular Disney characters. The man accepts, only to learn the position is that of a living target. A second target is soon hired, and the two fall in love. Having a child, they are terrified to learn their bosses intend to use the baby as a target. They quit, but the capitalist is quick to recuperate his losses. For nearly half a century, the United States and Soviet Union vied for world domination, at great economic and political cost. Their constant one-upmanship resulted in both sides stockpiling a nuclear arsenal that could destroy the planet many times over, with the US spending an estimated $8 trillion building up its military. The Soviet Union's expenses are said to have significantly exceeded that. While no direct contact was made, the death toll, factoring in proxy wars and related genocides, numbers in the millions. A brief period of peace in the 70s would give way to arguably the most tense phase of the Cold War. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to swell an uprising following a coup that placed the Communist Party in power the previous year. Under President Carter, the US retaliated by boycotting the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow and began sending aid to Afghanistan guerrilla groups, collectively known as the Mujahideen, in an attempt to push the Soviets back. This massively increased with the electing of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980. As we've seen, Reagan was a staunch anti-communist, and he ran on the promise of defeating the Soviets once and for all. Reagan pushed the narrative that the Soviet Union was an evil empire, and planned to squash communism by supporting insurgents opposing Soviet-backed governments. In addition to Afghanistan, the US extended aid to Nicaraguan and Angolan rebels, with all three conflicts eventually ending in Soviet defeat. In addition to this, Reagan increased weapon and defense spending, but the enemy he painted was far from the reality. After years of excessive military spending and economic stagnation, the Soviet Union was rotting from the inside. With the appointing of its final leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, in 1985, the USSR eased restrictions, allowing private ownership and foreign investment. Gorbachev also introduced glasnost, translated transparency, expanding freedom of the press, causing the government to lose control of the media narrative. Gorbachev sought to improve relations with the West and held a series of summits with Reagan, who, in 1987, encouraged him to tear down the Berlin Wall. In 1989, the Soviet states experienced a wave of revolutions, mostly peaceful, with many holding elections and ousting the Communist Party. Later that year, Germany was reunited with the fall of the Berlin Wall, seen as the symbolic end of the Cold War. The following year, Gary Bardem produced Seryi, Volk, and Krasnaya, Shapochka. Animated using stop-motion claymation, Bardem weaves the impending collapse of the Soviet Union with the fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood. A product of changing times, the film pokes fun at the government, which just a few years earlier would have landed Bardem in prison, or worse, while looking ahead to a prosperous future. The Soviet Union would officially dissolve on December 26, 1991. As for the fall of America, well, look around. Don't fret though, for everything must come to an end, including this series. Yes, we'll be wrapping up next time with a visit to the golden age of propaganda. That's right, we will be looking at how animation carried us through the dark days of the Second World War. Now, this was not meant to be an exhaustive history, and we will be exploring this subject further in a process video over on Patreon, patreon.com/pixandportraits. You can support us there. I will also post links to relevant material in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, and please share it, tell a friend. As always, thank you so much for your interest in this channel, and thank you so much for watching.